the last UX meeting, we talked about adding feedback on the Istio structural idiom, how the command should look. Everyone agreed to comment on the issue. No one has done so. We also talked quite a bit about the Istio version and having it check the Istio control plane version and refusing to work with back level control planes or ahead of level control planes. No one has commented on that issue as well. So please do so if you want that. Whoever's echoing, mute yourself. Who's doing the demo of Istio Analyze?
That's me, Chris Wilson.
Okay, excellent.
Also got Oz over here.
We should do that. And then after that, I wanted to talk about sort of maybe UX plans for Vadim's cluster isolation networking stuff. Can you run us through these two items?
Yeah, let me see if I can get this. Does somebody else have their mic on?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me see if I can share. Oh, cool. Yeah, I can try to make this a bit bigger. All right, well, that didn't work. Can everybody see this okay? I can make it a bit bigger. All right, so briefly, this is just demoing an implementation, well, Oz's implementation of the multi-resource analysis framework that he proposed. There's a link to the doc that I put in the agenda. I don't know how many people have seen that before. I know some of you have. So let me kind of highlight a couple of things that are cool here that this does. So it's implemented as a common framework that can be used both from the command line and also live in a cluster. So one of the things this means is, we can run it through Istio Analyze, which is what you see here. And we can, this is mode where we're running it against a live cluster, and we just say, okay, run the validators. It has a library of validators. Well, at the moment, the library is very small, but whatever validations that we would apply, we would then apply, and then we can get back things like this with specific unique error codes. One of the nice things, jumping down to the bottom, is the version of this library that is also running in Galley means that when you look at the object, you can see down here at the bottom there's the status field, and that's populated with the same error code. And so that's continually updated by Galley using the same underlying validation code. So another neat thing that we are able to do right now is we can look not just at the live cluster, we can also look at files. So if you wanted to analyze some files, some YAML files, you can do that. So if sorry about that. We look at something like this, where we're looking at a particular file, it will show us, hey, you've got a bad gateway there. And to be clear, what this is looking at is it's actually looking at, this isn't just syntax kinds of things, it's looking at, does this gateway actually exist in the object model? So the other cool thing is not only can we look at the live cluster and the files, we can actually basically do both. So we can take, starting from the base of the live cluster, we can essentially simulate what would happen if we applied particular files and see what sort of validation stuff comes up there. So that's about it for that.
Yeah, you want to recap the scenarios that's being captured? So just be clear.
Right. So the scenarios that we've got, you can look at live clusters. You can look at a set of static files. You can look at those files as it would work if they were applied to a live cluster. You can do all that through Istio Cuddle or whatever other interface you wanted to add. And it also works as something running as part of Galley that updates the status field. There's a status field updater component that means the same set of errors can show up in the actual CRDs that you can pull. So that's really nice because not only is it really visible if you just do a kubectl get or something like that, it's also available for other applications. So anything that wants to look at validation status would be able to look at that status field. Any other kind of UI sort of thing.
Seeing the status as text is bothering me because I think there had been a hope that we would have other fields in there as well. Can we make the text be a subfield of status?
I think so. So yes. Right now the easiest thing was to stick simply a text in there. But let me understand, what do you have in mind? What is the structure that you expect to see there?
I just instead of sending it some text, just send it the JSON with that text being like a message field, so that we can later on add other fields like has this gateway been disabled because it's invalid, which is something we want to add, or is this gateway so new that it's not yet been sent out to the sidecars, that kind of thing. Just put that text into a status/message.
Okay, maybe I'm confused. So today, this is essentially an array of text that's generated from an array of a bit more structured diagnostic messages, right? The diagnostic messages inside the framework carries information about where this is coming from, like the origin information. So if you look at, for example, the status here, you don't see the origin information because it's already tagged to the object. But if you look up top to the error message coming from the command line, it tells you which resource it's coming from, and we can make it richer, right? So, and this is kind of the extent of the diagnostic information. So are you suggesting that we extend the diagnostic model so we can attach more concretely typed things when we are analyzing, and so that they appear here? Is that the intention?
No, my intention is just that we not use the entire status field for an array of text, but that we put that array of text as a subfield of status.
So basically, we're not monopolizing the status field with this one particular application of it.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
And if we do that, we should probably put out the code into its own field, so you don't have to parse it out.
Yeah, yeah. So one way, there's kind of separate aspects to this, and one of them is we don't monopolize the status field. The other one, I think, is what Oz was talking about, where we structure this message a bit more, so that if we want to add fields or just type fields, that it's a bit more structured.
Yeah,
and those both seem very reasonable to me.
So I would like to see this get in as soon as possible, even if it's not complete, because I'd like to get people to try it out and to see if it is doing what they sort of want. Maybe not. So there's two things. So one is the command line, which I think is awesome and should go in because it involves no changes to the server at all, so it's very low risk, a nice little experimental command. The automated stuff in Galley, do we think that is going to be a resource hog, or is that going to be really simple? It seems like it has to run for every object upon every change to the cache of the CRDs.
So, okay. the code that does the status update is freshly written, right? So there's no performance work done on it, right? And it is based on a refactoring of Galley that is off by default in 1.3. So my plan is to make that refactoring on by default in 1.4 and maybe have this analysis.
I lost the audio.
Me too.
Maybe the question is that is it far from being lightweight?
Yeah, so I'm
Okay.
coming to that. So okay, so to answer that question, the model in Galley.
We dropped out?
No.
No.
You're back, but you
Okay.
dropped out for about a minute.
Okay. Should I rewind?
Probably then, yeah.
Okay, so let me then go very fast, right? So I expect, first of all, timing-wise, in 1.3, there's the Galley refactoring, which this depends on. That's going to be off by default. In 1.4, that's going to be on by default. And I think we should have the status fields updates off by default in 1.4 behind the flag. And in 1.5, we can make it on by default. So resource usage-wise, I think there are two parts to this. There's the status update controller, which is, I think, the most expensive thing that we need to have, which needs to keep track of all the resources and tries to update their resources. And we need to see it as we need to spend resources to make sure that it is optimized, right? So it keeps to the minimal amount of memory. But the actual analysis itself is based on the data model that Galley already keeps. So the Galley already keeps a set of resources in memory to create a snapshot of configuration to pass to pilot, and the analyzers are running simply on that object model, right? So I expect whatever analyzers that we write, which can be extensive, which can actually have which may not be written in the most performant way possible, right? So they may be a resource hog. So we need to be careful when writing the analyzers themselves that we are doing a good job. Does that make sense?
It does, and it sounds really great. I think it's something that people have been asking for a long time. So getting it in would be amazing.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a work in progress for at least a couple of releases, but and if we hide it behind a flag or have some variables making sure that if this is a heavily loaded system, for example, you have the option to run it much less frequently, I think we'll be okay.
Do we think we can get it in 1.3 just as a Istio Cuddle tool for people to use? Premature.
I think we will need to make our case to the release people. Since it's going to be a command line tool, I think we should be able to make our case. So there is, again, this is I would say this is mostly experimental code.
Yeah,
right?
under an experimental zone of the command line.
Does this share the same rule set as Istio and Cuddle Inspect, Ed?
No, so that's the thing, right? So there's only one rule at this point, right? And it's a showcase rule. There's nothing else. So and that's the one that's firing, right? So that's the one that we have. So there is the infrastructure part. I think it is mostly complete but experimental, and then there's the actual rule sets which don't exist today.
Which, when we're ready, the other topic that was kind of dovetailing with this is the survey of tools. There's a number of libraries that we can pull from.
So I can tell you that this has nothing to do with the Istio Cuddle Inspect, which is about asking Envoy what CRDs affect on that sidecar and then printing them out. And so that it's a sidecar and print thing, so it has nothing to do with everything. But we should probably go on to that survey. So I think people would like to see that breakdown. Can you walk us through that survey?
Yeah. Can you guys hear us okay? It's using my laptop mic. We could switch, I think, if it's a little quiet or something.
I hear you just fine, Chris.
Okay. Let me pull that up. There it is. So, share. There we go. So this is a doc I started a couple weeks ago, just trying to keep track of all the different things that we have going on here. Because as it turns out, there are quite a number of efforts either in various stages of completion or underway that are all trying to solve this problem of how can I tell when my Istio configuration is broken and go about debugging it. So we have an existing Istio Cuddle validate, which is mostly doing single object validation rather than multi-object validation. By the way, if any of you know more about kind of where that is or where it's going, I'm interested to hear about it. So far, it doesn't seem like anybody strongly owns it or has plans for it.
So all that thing is it invokes the same thing the webhook does. So it lets you validate what the webhook does without a live cluster.
Okay, that's useful to know. So it's using the same set of things there. And those are all, again, single object kinds of things. So Istio Vet is something that somebody built specifically for this job, right, of finding various common bugs and being able to report them. So they run it as their own command line tool that runs against a live cluster. There's a number of specific vetters that look for different issues. I listed KubeMan here, something I looked at. It tells you a lot about a Kubernetes cluster. As it turns out, it doesn't do much in terms of highlighting errors. So that's less directly relevant here. Kiali is really interesting because we use it primarily as a UI to inspect what a service mesh looks like, but it actually has a pretty good library of validation built into it. And it's actually a really good experience in a lot of ways because it will show you not only where you've got a mistake, it'll highlight it in the context of the YAML file or whatever that it detected that in. So it's a bit buried. I had no idea this existed, and I had to go digging a bit for it. But there's a pretty good library of stuff there, and I really like the user experience of being able to say, oh, look, there's an X next to my virtual services, and oh yes, I can see that this line of my YAML is highlighted. I should go fix that. So that's.
You want to mention your experiment, how you were able to?
Oh yeah. So one of the other things I was able to do both with Istio Vet and the Kiali is I took some of their library and ported it into the new validation framework that Oz wrote. So it's not the kind of thing where I can build an adapter or something. I need to rewrite stuff just because it's using slightly different object models and so forth. But both of them port reasonably well. And I think that the real value is in the rules that have already been kind of hammered out. Just porting those gives us a good starting point. I would really want to talk to both the people behind Istio Vet and Kiali in particular.
I think the Istio Vet owner was at the meeting last time. I don't know if he's here this time.
I'm here. Hi, Chris. This is Neeraj.
Yeah, hey. Nice to meet you.
So, same here. Whenever you need to talk, whether on this meeting or on a separate call, I'm available.
Okay. We'll follow up on that in a second. Mitch was going to talk about that in a bit. Let me finish getting through this. Anyways, yeah, there's a lot there. So proposed tools. So Istio Cuddle Inspect. I missed the last meeting where you guys were talking about that. And like Ed was just saying, it's not specifically aimed at validation, but it does have some usefulness, definitely, in helping to find these kind of multi-resource issues. And then finally, the multi-object validation framework that Oz proposed and banged out.
There's an inspect, validate, and analyze.
Right. So right now, exactly, yeah, and vet, although vet isn't part of Istio Cuddle, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff. There is considerable overlap in what kinds of things are covered, and also the kind of architectural approach behind it, which is the architectural approach overlap is good because it means that porting them is probably not going to be too bad. I mean, there's a fair amount of work involved just because there's a lot of volume of stuff to port. But I'm hopeful that if we reach out to people, we can maybe get some help with that.
Yeah, so on that note, I wanted to propose that we start having something like a subcommittee, set up maybe like an hour-long meeting next week. Each of us can show off what we've got in terms of validation for compare and contrast, and then we can begin working on kind of requirements. My concern is that we come up with a holistic approach to validation and status within Istio. I love all the effort and all of the initiative that's been taken. Now I think it's time, and we talked about this a little bit 2 weeks ago, that we all come together and unify to make sure that our user experience for validation and status is nice and seamless and smooth and consistent across platforms.
Totally agree with that. And I think I reached out, or Oz might have reached out to me. I don't know how it started, very early on in this process when he was just creating the framework. So I would be more than happy now that this framework is more mature to move some of the stuff if I can help or someone in my team can help. And at the same time, come up with a consensus on what validations do make sense. So I think that's great.
Yeah, and the Kiali side is, would be very interested to, kind of work with this with you guys to see what we can do there.
Great.
Awesome.
Who's talking?
This is Matt.
Okay.
There's also Mike on the call who's also on the Kiali team as well.
Okay, awesome.
So if I drop a link to a meeting invite for sometime next week in the agenda after the fact, is that enough to get everybody in the same room?
That is good. Put it in the Slack channel as well, in case people aren't looking at the agenda between meetings.
Good. And then are there significant validation and status efforts that are going on that are not represented here today that I should reach out to individually?
That's everything we found, right, in his document.
I feel like there might have been some talk about multi-cluster stuff, stuff related to our two clusters sharing a unique key. Do they have things expired? I know I had written some ad hoc tools for that, and I think we should ask if anyone else has those especially.
Okay, I'll put a invite in the agenda. I'll put it in Slack, and I'll probably reach out to the TOC members just to see if they know of, like, I don't think anybody from Cisco's here or VMware. See if they've got people who would be interested in the conversation as well. That way we get all of the voices in one place.
I think there was a brief discussion on the release side of Story for this kind of functionality. I'm guessing it's beyond 1.3, or is that also going to be settled in that meeting? That meeting next week, I meant.
Go ahead.
Okay. I think we can make a case for exposing something like this through the command line as an experimental tool for 1.3, but we have a limited time frame, and this particular framework has just one rule in it, right? So I think in its current form, it may not be that great to expose as is. We may need to add more things, but I think we have a shot at exposing this as an Istio Cuddle tool in 1.3. But otherwise, I think the right thing to do is shoot for a alpha-like thing in 1.4.
So one other thing, this is probably not a good idea, but I did, just as an experiment, I did a quick prototype where I took the entire Kiali validation library and just dropped it in as an Istio Cuddle command, and it can work like that.
Using this framework or just a
No, not using your framework, just using it as is.
I see.
Like
We
if,
don't want to do that.
I don't think we want to do that
Yeah.
because then we're creating another one that we're going to immediately get rid of.
Yeah, I think the priority is getting it right as we get it out to users so that it's a nice, consistent experience and something that we're not going to regret come 1.5, 1.6. If we get the ability to backport it and maybe get something out to the community before then in the form of an experimental Istio cuddle command, that sounds great. But my priority is making sure that we get it right in 1.4.
Yeah,
Okay.
that sounds good. I don't know if there are any release managers here. I was talking to two of them. I don't think it's going to be in 1.3. They have their hands full.
So that the Istio Cuddle Inspect does a little bit of validation, but it tries to be more it tries to be more like Describe and telling you sort of which rules are applied to your pod. Do we think that we should hold that work and try to roll into this, or should we try to put that work out for 1.3 in the sense of it being a synonym for Describe, and then try to migrate it into that stuff later so that maybe it does less but still does the Describe type stuff?
If it's an experimental, I'd say get it out and get it useful sooner, as long as it's not, as long as it's clear to our users that we're not necessarily committed to continuing that exact form of the command.
Okay.
Yeah, I think they are sufficient with different functionalities, right? One of them is looking at configuration and checking for validity. The other one is looking at a running cluster and giving you a quick diagnostic information, right? There is some overlap, but I see them as two relatively orthogonal, UX scopes.
So I could see a new user being shown the name of those two commands, being unsure how they differ. That's a long-term concern.
Yeah, seems like a name.
Would it help to call it experimental Describe instead of experimental Inspect?
I think that's a better name for differentiating between those two.
Okay. Great. So thank you very much for putting all of this together and also for the hard work with Oz's framework itself. It's a big PR and it seems like quite a valuable thing for future Istio.
Yeah, the PR is a work in progress. And by the way, comments and feedback are definitely welcome.
Yeah, so I don't want to hog the time, but one thing that I would appreciate, I think we should agree on at least, is the common diagnostic information model. So if you look at the multi-resource document, it describes a way to use codes and naming for these error messages. So I found this very useful in a previous life. If you go to especially some micro products, you will see that having these kinds of error messages makes finding things online or using tooling way easier. Right? That's why if nothing else, even if you don't align on implementations or anything else, aligning on some form of how do we do this in a so that we can create common documentation. I think this is useful.
I agree 100%. It's going to be so great to type these codes onto Stack Overflow and get suggestions on how to fix them.
Yeah.
Do we think that there's going to be contention over the particular numbers and letters so that they'll be changing? Because I think we should just go with it.
Yeah, I think there's going to be an initial bike shedding about the format and the things, but otherwise, I think number format, we need to allocate some number spaces for future. Say the first 100 one is reserved, up to 100. But after that, any new rule we add, we just increment the number. That's it.
Okay. Sometimes an error affects two things in a framework. I wanted to understand that. So let's have a virtual service that refers to a subset. Then I have a destination rule that defines that subset. Of course, the virtual service is the one that has a problem because it might refer to a subset that doesn't exist. Is there a thought about if the error message should be in more than one place? So you're looking at your destination rules? Should there be a message like there are virtual services that use subsets that aren't defined? Or should the messages appear in one place only on the receiver or user?
So we've talked about that a bit. Just so the idea, the way I guess I framed it in my head is not only can you have, you're pointing at something that doesn't exist, you can also have scenarios like you created something that should be referenced somewhere but isn't referenced anywhere. And really it's the same error probably, but it's kind of two sides. My own inclination is just to do both. I think that if you have multiple error messages, if it's really the same problem, that tends to make itself pretty obvious.
So you also don't want to clutter things. Also, that's the other side, right? I think I am personally a minimalist guy. I would say, like, in most of the time, try to pick one resource to tag things, the resource that you need to edit to make things work, right? Because that's where, like, most likely the error is. But in the cases such as those cases where things are not referenced, that's probably a different error code. It's a warning instead of an error saying that, hey, by the way, this is not referenced, or some counterpart error message about something different.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. So, I mean, a destination rule might have 3 versions. Only one is being referenced. That's not a problem. If 0 is being referenced, it is a problem. It's hard to know where to put the message.
Exactly. And Kubernetes, it's very common to have late binding in terms of config creation. There's no order for these things. We had similar issue with Istio Vet where we always thought these were warnings and never errors, because you might be in the process of creating a destination rule, even though you have a subset which is being referenced by virtual services. So
it makes me wonder if there should be a concept of more global errors that are not tied to any particular object, but I can take into account complex situations. I don't know how that works with the status field, of course, but conceptually, it seems the need is there.
I prefer if we can push the model all the way up to the point where we can't, where we have to have the global things. Like if we can avoid the global things, I think that's desirable, mainly because we want to have the same consistent experience with the status field, right? I truly believe that we should have that consistent model. But if we find a case where we simply can't, well, okay, we need to add a global one.
Can we come up with a CR that represents that, and the status field for that CR is the more complex rules?
I think one thing we are not doing is we are not publishing Kubernetes events, right? So we can actually also do that. And in all of these things, we can also publish Kubernetes events, and for those global things, you have to look at them, right? Mm-hmm. I think that would be the model. But I prefer very much to have an error message associated with a resource as much as possible.
And do we think that this should also apply to things that Istio creates, such as secrets that aren't part of our CRDs? Like a secret with an expired certificate because Citadel didn't renew it or something.
That almost sounds like a bug, right?
True.
So I think I don't know how to tell the user that, hey, there's an error, but it's not something that you can fix, or it's not something like, does it make sense? Like, it's like not something that you can edit and fix easily, kind of thing.
Well, maybe these errors aren't all just for the user, right?
I mean, we can certainly use the error codes to indicate things more concretely, right? So I believe in the model, like, we can have an Istio errors for runtime codes. I'm a bit worried about, for example, adding things like to status fields of things, or I don't know. I think it needs to be a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, cross-resource validation, I'm assuming, already includes things which are not Istio CRDs. Like, you might have to inspect a service to see if it has the right prefixes, right? So I'm assuming that's the case here. At least Istio Vet, we were looking at other resources other than Istio also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, can we attach a status field to non-Istio objects, or that's something you have to define in the CRD, isn't it?
Yeah, speaking, yes, but
You don't need to do it. You can do it you can do a kube control patch on an existing service and add things to it, and you
Okay.
can add events to it, even if you didn't define it.
The thing is, are you the only tenant of the status?
Mhm.
But when you do a patch, you can add your own field. So you could literally add to the status field of a service Istio status as a subfield of status.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, which goes back to your earlier point about not monopolizing the status field. I guess as long as we have our subfield inside there.
Well, great. This is wonderful. Thank you so much for presenting it.
Is there any way to query and ask, like, which objects have an error in the status? Or do you have to kind of go through each one by one and check it to, verify that there's no problems across your mesh?
Well,
You should be able to use a field selector on a subfield, right? I'm not sure.
I really haven't tried it, that's why.
seems like it should be possible.
Okay.
I don't know, my knowledge base says no, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not possible.
I think it's possible. I'll play with it tomorrow.
All right.
Let me start presenting again. So, I'd asked for some feedback on Istio Cuddle Inspect. Didn't get any, but we talked about it a lot at this meeting. So I wanted to talk about multi-cluster isolation and boundary in terms of the user experience. I don't know how many people are sort of aware of this. It's something that Vadim from IBM proposed. Let me open up this item. So I started writing about this. So the multi-cluster that we do with Istio, there's sort of three ways we normally have been talking about it. And Vadim has been proposing a way to do isolation in which he has some customers that need and some security features that he wants to add. I have a link to his proposal, which he has shown briefly at Environments and more thoroughly at the networking meeting. And I have a link to the issue about how services are currently exposed to everyone in the same root certificate. And he wants to control that so that, say, one branch of a bank couldn't look at all the services for another branch because of some industry standards for security that he's talking about. So in addition to those things, so the short version of what he's talking about is that in addition to what Jason has been talking about for connecting a mesh and Jason's controller and command line stuff for connecting meshes and getting the secrets and getting them to talk, Vadim wants to connect the services themselves and expose them in a way where they might even have different names. So you could offer different aliases. So for example, you could say my banking service V3 is aliased as banking public, and V4 is released as banking beta, or just totally rename the services that you offer. He's got a bunch of stuff for how to expose them, what other clusters can see them. And he's got some blog articles about that. I don't want to go into that because it was discussed with those other things, but I think these are great proposals from the point of view of security and being able to use them. And it took him quite some time to get them configured properly. All he had to do was create Istio CRDs to do these things, but it was a lot of work creating RBAC and virtual services and custom gateways and things. So I started drawing a picture of sort of the kind of federation we're doing and the kind of operator work that's being done for it. And I just wanted to get sort of the community's consensus on if this is sort of the right breakdown. So Jason has been federating these meshes. He's got PRs in a proposal for this multi-cluster install operator. The existing operator for Istio install that's coming out configures some things like Istio Core DNS that are needed for multi-cluster. And then there's the things that Vadim is talking about, a special operation to expose something, a special operation to consume something from a remote cluster, and a special kind of cluster called a DMZ, Demilitarized Zone Cluster, that maybe both the producer and consumer can talk to. It doesn't have any services in it itself to make it harder to talk. So Vadim proposed that myself and some folks on my team here, Mohammed and others, work on a API proposal and an operator for these operations. And I wanted sort of to hear if the community thought this was a good idea or a bad idea, and if this arrangement of putting it in its own operator was good, or if it should be merged into a community operator that's being used to connect clusters.
So what is, I guess there's a few questions here. One, did he find that the APIs that we currently provide are not sufficient, or that they're too low level?
He felt that they were low level. So first it took a lot of work to sort of create things properly. There were a lot of cases where if you didn't get a port number exactly matching, you didn't know it and things just didn't flow. And then once you did have it working, it was hard to tell how the low-level Istio CRDs gave you the high-level stuff you wanted. So at a conceptual level, he was thinking, I want to expose my reviews service on one cluster, and only the reviews service should be exposed. I want to consume it by product page, but I only want to consume from this other cluster. And maybe there's versioning differences, so I'm consuming one called public and private, and I want to expose one called V1 and V3. These were the kind of things that it was hard to tell when you had done what you had done.
Yeah, so I guess there's extremes here. There's Istio provides very powerful low-level capabilities, but that is cumbersome, as you described here. So we can keep introducing layers on top of that. I guess the thing that I would be concerned about is if we add an abstraction on top of that, is it going to solve a very specific use case, or is it common enough that it could provide a further kind of building block? So there's probably some balance to strike there, which, as you define an API, we have to explore. Because you have this compositional model where you could have multiple levels, and then you have a very opinionated API that solves one specific problem, but it doesn't quite solve another problem. So we introduce another API, then we have API proliferation.
Okay.
So I guess it's finding a way that maybe it's more of a comment on the process at which we arrive at whatever that API is. It sounds like you could do this through templating today. If you had, as part of your deployment scheme, you had some templates that given basically you'd wrap Istio, the current Istio APIs, and you create your kind of own de facto API on top of that, but it would provide you some capability to explore how what do you want the shape of these things to look like. That's already possible today, but we don't have a common scheme or common set of templates to expand it.
So I had worked on last year or a few months ago a proposal for templating that I had implementation. It sort of went nowhere. Some people thought it was too much, others too little. So now we thought we would attack it in this direction. Vadim has a blog post that he's trying to get approval on for the low-level stuff. And I guess what I wanted to do was to come up with some proposals for the high-level stuff and propose API for that. And I'll bring them to all the correct groups. I guess I'm looking for people who maybe want to collaborate on this and think it's the right things that we need right now. Is it part of Istio? Is it another tool that it is? I mean, is it core Istio? Is it an add-on that requires Istio? Sort of what sort of structure to give it?
Well, I'd say that the specific API design might, I think Vadim already discussed this in the context of networking environments. So for a specific API discussion, that might be seems like a more appropriate place to talk about it. What might be interesting or useful to talk about in the context of UX is generally what the answer to the problem is. This an Istio problem, or is this something that somebody else should solve? If it is the Istio problem, what are the common mechanisms that we would provide? Similar to the config working group. Okay, does it need to be an API in a CRD? How does it get reflected through status, kind of in a consistent way? For things that aren't part of the core API, what are helper mechanisms we can provide? Like you could certainly have this as an Istio command that would generate the respective underlying config, basically encoding a template within a command line tool. That might not be the right model. We might want to discard that. So I guess there's kind of twofold. It's what mechanisms do we want to provide and encourage, and then the specific use of those mechanisms, which seem like it might be better addressed in the networking or environments context.
Do we have anyone on this call who is doing multi-cluster stuff, who is looking for fine-grained work? If so, I'd like to collaborate with them.
Well, I'm looking at multi-cluster, and this is kind of one of the things I've been thinking about is what do we provide as a core API and what do we provide as utilities and kind of one-off things.
Okay.
And I'm trying to figure out what the right balance is. Some of it's tactical. Trying to create a API that covers every single use case, I've found to be pretty difficult to get consensus on. Not saying that we shouldn't pursue that, but there's near-term things that we can also do to make users' lives better. That I don't know, like, but in this particular case of exposing a service, defining an API that everybody's happy with might be particularly difficult. And I think there's some people who are looking at how we want to reorganize these two APIs anyway. So I'm not sure how that plays into it.
So for something like this Istio Core DNS, which is needed in some multi-cluster scenarios and not needed in others, what would be a good way to give a user feedback that they should have installed with Istio DNS? I can imagine a user installing. Currently, the default is no Istio DNS, but I'm told in 1.3 the default is going to be Istio DNS is going to be there. But if they tried to do some of the mesh federation stuff and they didn't have it, I want to get messages of the kind of validation stuff out. This is very different from the kind of validation we've been talking about on the call today. This is, I want my control plane to run this pod if I am doing a multi-mesh federation with secrets. Maybe that belongs in that framework, maybe not.
So the pattern that I seem to be gravitating towards, I'd be interested to see if other people, if it makes sense to other people, is that we can start, in terms of experimenting and getting early feedback, we could start with a CLI, and that kind of defines an API, and that could be a setup, so install core DNS. But you could also have a kind of a verify, say, does everything look correct based on what my intent was? But you're not running anything in the cluster. And depending on the granularity of these pieces, you can kind of compose them in different ways. So that defers the problem of defining a single API that addresses every single use case. And then over time, you could basically take that same logic or the APIs that gain traction, and you could move that into the cluster and define a real API for it. And so it's a path, kind of a migration path from a CLI experience to an operator CRD experience. I don't know if starting with an operator is the the easiest thing because you've got to define an API, and then you have this thing running in the cluster with super user privileges. And you've got to deploy it and upgrade it. And there's just a lot more work that's involved in maintaining something like that. And sometimes it's the frequency of how frequently these things change too. Is setting up core DNS something that people are continually doing, or is it something that you do once when you build your mesh? You want to make sure everything looks correct. The CLI might get us pretty far down that path.
I agree, but then I've been dealing with these small systems with 3 clusters in my multi-cluster mesh. If I had a bigger system and I was rolling stuff out dynamically, more things could happen, which is why I was thinking along the lines of eventually getting to an operator. But I think you're right, a command line is the way to test all this stuff. And then once we feel the frequency is high enough that we need to be continually dealing with it, then we need the operator.
Yeah, I like the idea that there's a path towards moving. There's an operator in either case, a human operator or a automated operator. But I think starting with the human operator, it's a lot easier to flesh out the recipes and what works well and what doesn't, rather than just automating something without understanding the problem.
Do we know anything about the pain points of people doing multi-cluster now?
Some. So some of the things I'm looking at, if you go to the documentation today for setting up some of the different multi-cluster scenarios, some of it is just kind of tedium, I think. So if you want to configure Pilot to talk to your remote cluster, there's a recipe for that. You can generate a secret and you label it accordingly and place it in the right clusters. But if you want to do that for more than 2 or 3 clusters, you're getting lost in environment variables in Bash. So the one PR I sent out yesterday for comment was making that a little bit easier. So you can just say, I want to create a secret for cluster N, and then you can install that in all of your other clusters in the mesh.
So I reviewed that PR, but I only reviewed it for the error messages and verbiage that it had. And I was wondering, your example showed 3 clusters, and it made sense for that. Do we think it needs, or if you were doing it for more than 3, you'd almost want to put it in some kind of bash loop, or you'd want to give it arguments to let it generate for more than 1.
Yep.
Do we have it might be good to add either as an aside to that item or some text about how we might do it for 10 or 100 nodes, just so people would understand.
Right, so that's where the building block nature of this comes. I think Constant has made mention of this, that you can have a single tool that does everything, or you can kind of have the Linux command line philosophy where you have a tool that does one thing, and you're expected to compose it. So at least to get a better understanding of the pain points and see if it makes life easier, that is one consideration. So you can have, the tool is not going to do everything when it's going to drop you down from 15 steps to 1 step. But then you could wrap that 1 step in a bash loop, which doesn't seem very elegant, but most people understand. However, if that bash script becomes 10 or 15 lines long, it's probably a good idea that we should reconsider the underlying commands, or maybe create a real API to wrap that all.
And thank you for that PR, by the way, Jason. I think it's in the right direction. Okay, that is everything I have on the agenda. Do we have anything else to discuss before the next meeting, other than that we're going to set up this other meeting? Okay, so let's chat on the user experience Slack channel for when we think that this summit of validators should happen, and start having them. Anything else? Okay, thank you, everyone.